Dear Minister, Your Excellencies, honorable guests, dear Rector, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, it really is a privilege and honor to welcome you here at this event, an Ambassador's Lecture event co-organized with the Wilfried Martens Fund. And of course, it's a particular honor to welcome today our speaker, Foreign Affairs Minister Tobias Billström. We are looking forward to learn about the Swedish and European perspectives, policies on war and peace, and that in this so-called turbulent times. We are proud to host such a distinguished speaker today, who has a very long and rich career in politics in Sweden for more than 20 years. You have been assuming important roles in the political party, the parliament, and the government. And actually, I personally believe you have a profile that one day may lead to an important role also at European or international level, if I may attempt to predict the future. But more about your personality, the introduction of both the speaker of today and of the topic of today will be provided by Professor Steven van Hekken shortly. Let me just mention a couple of aspects showcasing the intense collaboration that we have at Sky Leuven with many Swedish universities and institutions. I would like to give you a couple of numbers. We currently have no less than 92 registered educational agreements between the different faculties, programs, departments of our universities with various faculties and universities of Sweden. On average, the last couple of years, we have sent out about 100 students from our university to Sweden to follow part of their study program there or for scientific visits, internships, and the like. And currently, at this very moment, we are hosting 80 Swedish students in our university. That's more about the educational aspect, what we are there for as a university, but of course we are also a research-intensive university, and we do like to collaborate, to interact with partners worldwide within Europe. And in that respect, Sweden is also one of the privileged partners for many of our researchers. Actually, when we look at the portfolio of joint publications with international institutions and authors, Sweden takes rank number 12, which is quite amazing given the size of the country. And this, of course, no surprise, is with the best Swedish universities, among which, and I'm not going to name all, Chalmers, the University of Technology, the University of Gothenburg, Lund, which is a LERI partner and also a partner in our global network, Universitas 21, Stockholm University, Umeå, Uppsala, KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, and the Karolinska Institute. The latter, one of the most prestigious health sciences institutes of the world, actually is the most important Swedish partner for our university as research is concerned, for instance, in number of joint publications. So, lots of things in common with Sweden, of course, also in policy, and this is hopefully what we will learn about. But let me also say a few words about the concept of the Ambassador's Lecture series and about the international policy of our university. What you probably all have read when registering for this lecture on the website of the Ambassador's Lecture series is that we would like to invite, or we aim to have as host, as guests, distinguished members of the diplomatic community and high-level members of international organizations, and that on a regular basis. We want to invite them to Sky Leuven to speak on a topic of joint interest, and also, and that is very important, to interact with the academic community on this topic. So I hope you got a warning that you are also expected to answer a couple of questions at the end of this event. As Sky Leuven, we are an institution that has the ambition to become truly international as a university. This is actually for quite some time now one of the priorities of our strategic plan. And that means that we want to provide ample opportunities for all our students and also for staff to have a rewarding, high-quality international experience while they are with us. We want to create a welcoming and warm and high-quality environment for international students, staff, researchers, professors at our different campuses in Flanders. We do this also by creating strategic partnerships with leading universities in Europe and globally. And we are an active initiative-taking member of university networks, again, both at the European scale, but also globally. Currently, we put lots of emphasis to engage in the European higher education area, for example, by taking up an as much as possible leading role in Una Europa, which is one of the European university alliances where we share lots of activities with partners from different countries of Europe. Not from Sweden, but we have Swedish university friends being part of other European university alliances. Being a European university, for us it is also important to stand for European values. This is what we share with all our partners in this continent and what we also have agreed, I think, as European community. Values like human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And this is very important also in the actions and the collaborations that we stand for as a university. Supporting this international and European dimension, we believe it is very important to discuss about how our society is organized, taking into account the different perspectives that exist around the world. This evidently also is important for the whole academic community, students, staff, professors, and other members of our university community. And actually, this is what we want to stimulate and to strengthen by speakers like the one of today in our Ambassadors Lecture series, giving a forum to leaders in diplomacy, politics, and society, and sharing their perspectives is really a way towards reaching this. Today, this will be on war and peace, where Swedish and European roads cross, as the title says. No need to stress that this is a very timely topic with the Russian aggression in Ukraine still ongoing. Far too much, too long, much too long, too many lives have been wasted. We all share our sympathy with the Ukrainian people and we all want this war to stop as soon as possible. War and Peace is the title of the lecture of today. The perspectives of peace really is what we are longing for. So let's now proceed with the program and move over to Professor Steven van Ecken. As I mentioned in the beginning, this lecture is co-organized with the Wilfried Martens Fund, who has a long tradition of hosting lectures and speakers like today. We owe a lot to him. I very much appreciate the opportunity he created to have you here, dear Minister. And I leave now the floor for an academic introduction of speaker and topic to our colleague Steven van Ecken. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Rector. Your Excellency, Minister Tobias Billström, geachte Minister van Staat, dear Rector and Vice Rectors, dear President of the Board of KU Leuven, geachte decaan en eredecaan van de faculteit Sociale Wetenschappen, dear Mr. Welle, former Secretary General of the European Parliament and visiting professor at this university now, beste familieleden van wijnen Wilfried Martens, minister van Staat, voormalig eerste minister, Europarlementslid en EVP-voorzitter, dear colleagues, dear students, dierbare studenten, beste alumni, ladies and gentlemen. Here together at the promotiezaal in Leuven or online. Allow me to start with some comments on the venue of today. As you can see, Minister Billström, we saved the historical grandeur of this university with former rectors, mostly Monseigneur, I hope you still feel comfortable, closely watching us, what we will be talking about today. We saved this venue with the biggest grandeur for the best possible occasion. In 2015, you were already here in Grote Aula, better known by the students as MTC, Maria Theresia College, when European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker gave the first Future of Europe lecture of the Wilfried Martens Fund. And you were here too in 2017, when you attended the same event with Wolfgang Schäuble, then German Federal Minister of Finance, in the Pieter de Sommer Aula. Today, we are very honored and pleased to welcome you again at this university. Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, it was Tobias Billström who, in his capacity as EPP Vice President, initiated what would become the KU Leuven Wilfried Martens Fund, established in Brussels in December 2014. I think, Minister Billström, you're one of the few, maybe the only one, of your political generation that have actually known Wilfried Martens personally, as well as worked with him professionally. I remember very well your presence at that establishing event in the Salle Roi Baudouin of the Palais des Académies, together with a number of people here on the first rows. Since then, the fund has organized several events, as has been mentioned, granted 7 scholarships to non-EU students, and awarded 15 alumni of this university from 5 different countries with a thesis prize. So far, no one from Sweden, but that might change maybe after today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, Tobias Billström himself holds an MPhil in Historical Studies from the University of Cambridge and an MPhil in History from Lund University. 20 years ago, he became a member of the Riksdag, the Swedish Parliament. He was Minister for Employment, Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy, and since October, Minister for Foreign Affairs. Sweden has a particular reputation, a country the same size as Belgium when it comes to inhabitants, as well as GDP. Well, you have a bit more GDP, but we compensate with a little bit more of public debt. A little bit. Every country has its problems, often the same issues many are struggling with these days, like migration. But Sweden is also and is still seen as a role model in terms of social welfare, female rights and participation in politics. Yesterday was International Women's Day. High environmental standards, development cooperation, soft power diplomacy, a tradition of minority governments. We are experimenting a bit at the Flemish level, but it's not sure whether we will succeed, probably not. And the value attached to transparency and accountability in our democratic societies. So by becoming an EU member state in 1995, together with Austria and Finland, and with this track record, you made the European integration project more Swedish. In other words, I think, stronger, more democratic for sure. Not a coincidence then, I think, that the current government choose as its priorities for the Swedish presidency of the EU security, resilience, prosperity, democratic values, and the rule of law. This is not the only thing that your country gave us. Your country also gave us Volvo, IKEA, meatballs. IKEA meatballs, very popular here in Flanders. And of course, ABBA, next to Roxette, and the rock band Europe. Talking about Europe and its Eurovision Song Contest, you won no less than 6 times. That's the second place after Ireland. So thank you for the music and filling our homes with lots of furniture. Talking about ABBA and Waterloo, and now I'm a bit more serious. Already 1 year ago, Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the European Commission, called Ukraine the Waterloo of the current Russian regime. Very strong words, I have to say, making reference to this small Belgian city known for its iconic battlefield of 1815, only 35 kilometers from here. Russian propaganda has its own references. These days, they refer, when they talk about the preparation of the current spring invasion, as the second Stalingrad. Also very strong words. As I explained to my students last week when I was teaching them the history of the European integration process since the Second World War. So war is back in Europe. So it goes without saying that you have taken office, Minister Billström, in turbulent times for your country as well as for the rest of the European Union. Moreover, as I have already mentioned, in the first semester of this year, your country holds the presidency of the Council of the EU, so more than ever, the eyes are on Stockholm these days. As you said yourself recently in the Riksdag, presenting your foreign policy priorities, and now I'm quoting you, Sweden finds itself in a new era. There is no other way to describe it. The rumblings of a large-scale war in Europe can be heard once again, and we are undergoing the greatest reappraisal of our foreign policy since we became a member of the European Union. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine demonstrates boundless contempt for international law, the European security order, and the most fundamental rules of the UN Charter. We must have no delusions. It is not only Ukraine's freedom that is at stake, but also our freedom here in Sweden, end of quote. And allow me to add, it's not only the freedom of Sweden and Ukraine, but it's the freedom of the rest of Europe that is also at stake. In the 9 months before you became responsible for foreign affairs, Sweden, together with Finland, applied for NATO membership. As I understood well yesterday, as foreign minister, you signed the act through which Sweden will become member of NATO and now has to pass the parliament later on this month. So I think taken together, this is one of the most extraordinary, in the meaning of unforeseen, consequences of the war in Ukraine, making an end to no less than 200 years of neutrality. Next to that, apart from Poland, the war came the closest to your member state with the attack on Nord Stream in Swedish territorial waters. As I have understood, the investigation by an independent Swedish body is ongoing, and we simply need to wait for its outcome, despite several media speculating these days with various theses about different responsibilities. So we don't know yet. What we do know, however, are the many challenges that lie ahead of us. Let me start with a couple of general questions about the current state of affairs as a trigger to your lecture and later on the Q&A with the audience. So yourself, you refer to a new era, but are we really witnessing a new era? And what do we mean by that when we are using the term new era? After all, what has changed after more than 70 years of European integration if still the Americans and the British have to intervene when there is a war in Europe, just like during the Second World War? What does that say about more than 70 years of European integration? Okay, fine, let's discuss then the European army. But what's the point if we still do not have a common foreign policy? That's the famous Herman Van Rompuy argument. Why should we talk about an army if we don't have a foreign policy yet? Will this momentum since last year be taken by the EU? Will things ever be the same again? Is this the final countdown for EU geopolitics? And with regard to your country, Sweden, there is no lack of hot topics or hot issues in foreign affairs, neither. As Sweden has applied for NATO membership, do you expect your country to become not only closer to Washington, but perhaps also to Brussels, given the fact that Sweden is a member of Schengen, but not of the Economic and Monetary Union, will becoming a NATO member bring your country closer to Brussels? And why is it that Sweden, we always thought it was the European champion of pacifism, is now one of the countries sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine? How do we need to understand it? And of course, what do you think when Hungary and Turkey will finally ratify Swedish accession to the EU? I understood that today even talks were going on in Brussels, as I read in this news bulletin. So I think a lot of issues to discuss also after Minister Billström's speech, as there will be ample time for questions from the audience, so please keep that in mind. But first and foremost, Minister Billström, may I ask you to take the floor in the framework of the Ambassador Lecture Series and ask the audience to welcome our guest speaker of today with a warm applause. Thank you.
So, esteemed professors, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to speak before this audience today, and I would like to convey a special thanks to Professor Stephen Van Hacke for arranging this invitation. Some years ago, 8 years ago, in my former capacity as Vice President of the EPP, I had the honor to be a part of the establishment of the Wilfried Martens Fund, and I'm particularly pleased to see his youngest daughter, Sarah Martens, present here today in the audience. Given how much that has changed over these past 8 years, it almost feels like a lifetime ago, as our continent since has undergone geopolitical shifts. Europe has experienced the biggest migration crisis in modern history, putting enormous strains on many countries. We have all lived through a pandemic that has demonstrated the vulnerabilities of our globalized economies, but also the opportunities of living and working differently. And sadly, we have seen one of our member states leave the European Union. But more importantly, we are witnessing the greatest challenge to European peace and security since World War II. When Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border a little more than a year ago, launching a full-scale invasion of Europe's second largest country, a free, a sovereign democracy, it evoked the beginning of a dark shift in European history. This is not to say that the invasion came as a surprise, nor that Europe's security policy readjustment had not already begun. But there is no question that the invasion marked a turning point. We are now 1 year into Russia's unlawful and horrific full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a year in which Russia has not only isolated itself completely from the rest of Europe, but demonstrated its utter disregard for the fundamental rules and principles of international law and the UN Charter, and for the European Security Order. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine runs counter to everything that we believe in. It has brought an end to a period of liberal and democratic renewal after the fall of the Iron Curtain. It has given rise to a greater geopolitical realism and challenged the basic truths that used to govern European security. Yet, contrary to Putin's vision of challenging international law and establishing a sphere of influence while weakening the EU and NATO, Russia's aggression has brought the reverse, greatly enhanced unity and solidarity in Europe and the transatlantic area, and demonstrated readiness and an ability to act. The EU and NATO have stood side by side and shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine while it has heroically defended its territory and democracy. Against this background, let me share a few reflections on what has been done, both at the national and European levels, and what needs to be done next. Firstly, a few words on the European response and on the Union's common foreign and security policy. We have learned from history that the greatest threat to international peace and security comes when the geopolitical status quo is challenged by an emerging power. While Russia is not an emerging power, but a revisionist one, European history teaches us that this can be just as dangerous. President Putin has clearly demonstrated that he is prepared to go far and take immense risks to achieve his imperial ambitions. In addition to being an unprovoked and unjustified attack on a peaceful neighbor, it is a war of values, a war against our system of governance and against global norms of international cooperation. The Russian idea of a system organized around regional spheres of influence is de facto a system where might makes right. If Russia were to succeed in subjugating Ukraine, it would not stop there. Rather, Ukraine would undoubtedly be one of several tests to the rules-based international system on which the whole of Europe's security and prosperity rely. President Zelensky is therefore right. His brave soldiers are not only fighting for the survival of Ukraine, but also in defense of our collective values and security. Our single most important task remains to provide maximum support to the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom and democracy. Nothing is more important than standing with Ukraine, and to do so for as long as it takes. European and transatlantic unity have been steadfast so far. In close coordination with the US and other partners, the most wide-ranging sanctions ever adopted by the European Union are now firmly in place, and we are constantly working on closing loopholes and tackling circumvention. On the anniversary of Russia's invasion, the EU adopted its 10th package of sanctions. The EU has also adopted sanctions against Iran for supplying Russia with drones. EU airspace have been closed to all Russian-owned aircraft, and a number of Russian and Belarusian banks have been banned from using the SWIFT system. These measures have been taken in parallel to our provision of substantial humanitarian aid. Ukraine and Moldova and robust macro-financial assistance to stabilize Ukraine's economy and maintain its basic public services. Military equipment has been delivered through the European Peace Facility, the EU's instrument for providing military and security support, totaling more than €3 billion to date. A new military training mission, EUMAM Ukraine, has been launched in record time, and our civilian mission, EUAM, is providing support to Ukrainian civilian authorities. The European Council and the Council of Ministers are closely monitoring and regularly discussing the situation on the ground and the EU's continued united response. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has been on the agenda of all Foreign Affairs Council meetings since the full-scale invasion began. Ukraine, along with Moldova, has been granted EU candidate status. The war has highlighted the central importance of the enlargement process as a tool for building stability and security in our neighborhood. This remains the case also for the Western Balkans. Continuing the EU integration process of a region remains key. Meanwhile, the EU has adopted its strategic compass as a guiding document for developing security and defense cooperation in the coming 5 to 10 years. It includes the strengthening of our security in new domains such as space, cyber, and hybrid threats, a revitalized EU capacity to act in crisis management missions, both militarily and civilian, investments in new capabilities, as well as the tailoring of stronger relationships with partners. The EU's relationship with NATO is stronger than ever and continues to make tangible progress, demonstrating and reinforcing the strength of the transatlantic bond. Russia's aggression has shown both how essential NATO is for the collective defense of its members and the EU's complementary role in sharing the burden of maintaining international peace and security. In this context, let me just stress that there is no going around the fact that the role of the US for European security remains indispensable, including for the Nordic-Baltic region in which Sweden is situated. These are all examples of how the Union's response to the invasion of Ukraine has been a true manifestation of our strength when acting together. In many ways, It has been a year of testimony to the strength of the EU's common foreign and security policy, including its reinforced role as a vital tool of the Euro-Atlantic community. Europe must now build on the steps we have taken in the past year to sustainably safeguard the security of our continent. Today's increasingly competitive international security environment has brought new prominence to transatlantic relations, not least the areas of security and defense. My government is convinced that many of the challenges we face are best dealt with through close cooperation within and between the EU and NATO, and together with other countries around the world who share our commitment to the rules-based international order. The EU has no other option but to become a stronger and more coherent geopolitical actor. A strong Europe and a strong transatlantic link are mutually reinforcing. The transatlantic relationship is also a key artery to the world economy. The EU and the US have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship globally and represent the most integrated trade area in the world. Likewise, cooperation and coordination with the United Kingdom and other key partners have been exemplary during the past year and remain essential to our continued response. The recent announcement that the EU and the UK have found a solution to the Northern Ireland situation is a very welcome step forward, also when seen in the larger context of being able to work even more closely together in the future. We are in the beginning of a long journey in which we need coalitions of nations, reaching beyond our traditional allies. Beyond Euro-Atlantic cooperation, the war has had a mobilizing effect in other parts of the world. We can see this in the strong global response in the UN General Assembly, where more than 140 countries have condemned Russia's aggression. We need to remain committed to the global agenda and an enhanced EU global outreach. The EU and the Indo-Pacific are closely intertwined and face several common challenges. To this end, I look forward to hosting an Indo-Pacific ministerial in Stockholm this spring as part of our EU presidency. The Swedish presidency will also contribute to highlighting and advancing the EU's role as a strategic partner to the African Union and to the many African countries with which we are already working closely. Cooperation with the EU's southern neighborhood remains key. Likewise, the countries in the Middle East are our neighbors, and the EU is fully engaged in a wide range of issues there. We also welcome the ambitions for an enhanced EU engagement and partnership with the Latin American and the Caribbean. Secondly, let me say a few words about Swedish foreign and security policy in the light of Russia's aggression. Like everyone in Europe, Sweden depends on a rules-based international order rooted in liberal ideas of openness, international cooperation, and free trade. We are strong believers in the multilateral cooperation, including through our long-standing engagement in the United Nations. We have trade relationships and an innovative and competitive business sector that benefit from an open world economy. Respect for international law has always been a cornerstone of Swedish foreign and security policy. The alternative, where might makes right, is not in our national interest. As these fundamental interests are currently being challenged in Ukraine, security has become a top priority for my government. For Sweden, Russia's aggression has forced a fundamental reassessment of our basic security and defense policy assumptions. Sweden's NATO accession is a top priority for my government. We strongly believe that NATO membership for Sweden and Finland will strengthen our security as well as that of the alliance and of Europe as a whole. We are strengthening our resilience, though, for instance, through, for instance, significant investments into our defense capabilities. We are committed to meeting NATO's goal of 2% defense spending by 2026 at the latest. The Swedish Prime Minister recently appointed a National Security Advisor and is establishing a National Security Council to strengthen the whole of government approach to security. We are reinforcing our national capabilities to respond to disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and hybrid influence. Since February 2022, Sweden has contributed around 1.3 billion to various initiatives in support for Ukraine. We have given 960 million euros of these for military equipment and 45 million euros for civilian crisis management. And we are committed to standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thirdly, regarding European cooperation, my government is guided by a simple premise. To secure lasting peace on our continent, the EU must be further strengthened. Sweden assumed the presidency at a time of historic challenges for EU member states and for the Union. An increasingly challenging international environment means that the EU needs to become faster and more effective in our ability to decide and act. Unity is the basis of our strength, and as the rotating presidency, an important objective for Sweden is to contribute to a united, engaged, and efficient Union. The EU must be able to speak with one voice. The role and mandate of the High Representative Borrell is obviously key in this regard. Another useful tool is the practice of deputizing, where the High Representative asks a minister or a group of ministers to undertake a visit or deliver a message on his behalf. We should, to my mind, use this tool even more in the future to ensure required EU presence worldwide. Decisions by unanimity are always the preference, but for the EU to become a truly capable global actor, I also support the use of constructive ways for member states to, for example, abstain to allow action when such is supported by a broad majority in the Council. We should also explore the use of qualified majority voting in certain areas of our common foreign and security policy, through using the mechanisms that are already available within the treaty. This could, for example, pertain to statements on human rights in multilateral fora or decisions on sanctions. In this increasingly competitive environment, issues such as trade, energy, and technology are all building blocks in the race between the leading economies. In this new area, we must promote security in the broadest sense. We need to enhance our geo-economic resilience. The economic and security environment in the Indo-Pacific is important to Europe's future. Regarding China, our interest in EU unity and solidarity and transatlantic coordination, we must solidify the transatlantic dimension of the EU's China policy. And during our presidency, we look forward to hosting the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, in which we can create a transatlantic playing field with joint rules, regulations, and policies. Together, the EU and the US make up 40% of the world economy. But to stay competitive, we must further increase our global trade opportunities. By strengthening competitiveness, reducing vulnerabilities, and ensuring that trade flows function also in times of turbulence, we must also contribute to address our security interests. Lastly, Sweden is already more than 1/3 into its EU presidency, a presidency in which we have made support to Ukraine and its path to the EU and continued pressure on Russia at the top foreign policy priority. Accountability for the crimes committed as part of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is an important part of this, as are fostering international partnerships, consolidation of democratic values in terms of resilience and enlargement, and strengthening the EU as a security policy actor. To this end, the new EU working group that will explore the use of frozen Russian assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine, the 10th package of sanctions, additional EPF packages, the recent EU-NATO declaration, and the new International Center for the Prosecution of Crime of Aggression are examples of what we have delivered so far. President Zelensky's visit to Brussels to meet with the European Council sent a very, very powerful message of our unwavering commitment to Ukraine. Another concrete example will be the adoption of a new civilian CSTP compact as part of the implementation of the strategic compass. Sweden also sees the need for a stronger EU in order to address hybrid and cyber threats. The strategic compass has outlined clear priorities for the development of a hybrid toolbox, a foreign information manipulation and interference toolbox, and to further strengthen the cyber diplomacy toolbox. We will do what we can to advance these files in the spring, as we believe that they are key to increasing our collective resilience and meeting the security threats of today and tomorrow. In many ways, today's security environment is different from that of yesterday. The threats to our international rules-based order continuously takes new forms. To face these, the EU must remain agile, strategic, and resilient. Today I have shared some reflections on how this has been done over the past year. By building on these cornerstones, I believe that Europe will be equipped to meet the challenges of the new era, for freedom, in unity, and for a safer and more secure future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Billström, for making a broad sketch of the big challenges that lie ahead of us with clear statements as long as it takes, as well as quite detailed in specific areas like your plea for extending for qualified majority voting within the Foreign Affairs Council as far as human rights and sanctions is concerned. I think I already have an answer to my question. Is your country closer to Brussels? I think yes, this is a kind of a statement that not all the founding members or their foreign ministers today would make, I think. Thank you very much. The floor is open to the audience. We have microphones on the left and on the right. Please keep your questions short, smart, and precise. For longer statements, when you become an ambassador or a minister, you will be given the floor later on. Good. Who is the first to kick off? Yes. Fifth row there.
Do you have a time frame on when Sweden wants to join the ERM2 to join the Eurozone?
Okay, a question on economic and monetary union. So Sweden, treaty-wise, has to become a member of economic and monetary union because you joined after the Maastricht Treaty, so no permanent opt-out at the British had and Denmark still has. So on paper, you still need to become a member. There was a referendum in Sweden on the euro. What is the current state of affairs as far as membership of the Eurozone is concerned? Thank you for this question.
Thank you very much for the question. No, I do not. That's a very clear answer. And the reason is just as Professor Van Hacke said, that we had a referendum in 2003 and that left us with a negative result when it comes to joining the euro and thereby also joining the monetary union. We still have negative figures in the opinion, and there is no real push in the Swedish society for changing be out or going back and have another referendum in the foreseeable future. But who knows, things might change. But at the moment, this is the situation as it is.
Okay, indeed, everything that happened since last year might be a kind of a reminder that things can change very quickly and dramatically. Thank you. Next question, please. There was here one on the 5th row. Yes, please. And then first, briefly introduce yourself and then raise the question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Henrik. I'm studying European Studies at Leuven, and my question to you is, what is your stance on Gripen fighter jet deliveries? I know that the Swedish government has not ruled it out, but do you think Ukraine can win the war without fighter jet deliveries? And if it's for a certain time frame, what needs to happen for those deliveries?
Thank you very much. I will repeat what my Prime Minister said at a press conference just a few weeks ago, namely that we do not rule out anything when it comes to aid to Ukraine. At the present, there is no push for fighter jets, and of course it's a complicated thing, much more complicated to provide that kind of military equipment, especially when it comes to training of pilots, than to send artillery or to send tanks. But again, there shouldn't be anything left out in the discussion and the debate about this. And it's also a question, as I said, about doing it in dialogue with Ukraine. This, I think, is the most important thing.
Okay, is it discussed currently in Sweden whether to grant over, so to say, fighter jets to
Well, you know,
Ukraine?
If it was, I wouldn't really, be mentioning it in a large audience like this for obvious reasons, because some of these things are military secrets. But I can be very clear on this matter. No, we don't have a discussion on this right now.
Okay, good, thank you. Next question, here on the 3rd row, please.
Thank you for the speech, Minister. I'm a student both from KTH and Leuven. From the history I learned, the neutral policy in Sweden has produced a large benefit and profit to the whole country since for the last 200 years. And now the decision to join NATO and to quit the neutral policy, does this decision express a relatively conservative and pessimistic opinion to the future of Europe and the world from the Swedish government?
Thank you very much. This is a very, all the questions that have been asked have been very important, but this is, I think, under the current circumstances, extremely important when it comes to clarify a few things. It is true that the decision to join NATO ends a 200-year-old policy, not of neutrality, but of being a non-aligned military aligned member of a military alliance. We have not been there for 200 years. And I think that this decision came about and started to take off in 2008. This is where the discussion started, because that is the year when Russia invaded Georgia. And that brought, in my mind, an end to this period of peace that we had seen. What has happened afterwards have, how should I say it has further aggravated the situation, but 2008 was a defining moment for Sweden. It showed that Russia was capable, willing to use military force to achieve its political means in the field. And this started the debate where my party, because we in 2008 started our discussion and ended it with a firm decision that we should become NATO members. So for my party now, when we are in government, this is not a huge decision. For other parties, this has been a more drastic decision to take. For those of you who are familiar with Swedish political life, that means, for instance, that it was much harder for the previous government to make the decision to hand in the letter of intent to the Secretary General of the NATO than what it would have been for this government. And for my part as foreign minister, the process now is something which I look upon as a natural state of affairs from that point of view, despite the dire situation that we are in. This decision didn't come about, however, easily. It isn't an easy thing to change. But you have to do it when you see that you cannot provide security for your population in a different way. In no way Sweden would have been able to produce the amount of resources necessary to maintain a military that can be, reasonable in relation to be a neutral partner. And we also have to take into consideration Finland, with whom we have a very strong relationship and also a long row of military agreements and joint training and joint military missions. When you take all this into account, it was sensible when Finland, that has a land border with Russia, which is, 1,300 kilometers, when they said that we need to join NATO in order for us to feel safe and secure, to do the same thing. We should have done it before. That is my opinion. We should have started this discussion before in Sweden. But it was the right and proper thing to do. And when Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, all states who have a coastal line at the Baltic Sea will be NATO members, bar Russia. And that will do a lot to change the security for the better in this part of the world. We enter NATO with a 360-degree approach, so it's not just a question of the Baltic states. We will be a security provider for all NATO member states, of course. But I'm mentioning this geographical military fact because it's important to understand why this joining is changing so much. This was a lengthy answer, but I'm sure that the NATO membership is very high on everybody's mind in here. It usually is in many audiences nowadays.
Indeed, and we are very happy to leave our traditional Western European view of things. So it's very important also for us to have this Baltic perspective. I think in the Baltic states, they are very happy and pleased that both Finland and Sweden will join. And I think the situation in Finland was a bit similar. So the center-left was often, or for a long time, reluctant as far as NATO is concerned, like in Sweden, although it was also a center-left government that applied, while the center-right traditionally has been more in favor of NATO membership, right?
Exactly. So it is. And it was, I think, a sign also, I'm happy that you mentioned the Baltic states. My first visit abroad went, as foreign minister, as it always does for a newly appointed Swedish foreign minister, to Finland. This has been the traditions for decades. My second visit went to Estonia, because this is also important to show that our policy our foreign policy is going to be a bit directed towards the neighborhood, not losing the global outlook, not at all, but bringing into mind that the Baltic states, who also have a land border, have a history with Russia, which also makes them worried about what is going on right now. And it is important for Sweden to show solidarity with them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question, maybe a bit further there. Yes. Please briefly say who you are and then your smart question.
I'm Ernest. I'm a student of European Studies. Thank you, Minister, for your speech. I just have one question. Since you mentioned Sweden and the European Union has unwavering support for Ukraine because this war was considered an attack on the political system and then the rule-based order now. And then I was just wondering if there's a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Will Sweden or EU has an unwavering support for Taiwan as well?
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is also a very good question.
We have only very good students, so it's not a surprise to us.
I was just going to say that. But it's good because it gives me an opportunity to expand and elaborate a bit about why I think that this war in Ukraine is also important for other countries who are not European. Because the Russian war in Ukraine is a colonial war. It is a war of colonialism and imperialism. It is a return to the times that we thought that we left behind in 1945 and with the signing of a UN Charter with its clause article. It's a very clear article prohibiting aggression, war of aggression. So my clear answer is that if such a thing were to happen, it would certainly have consequences, of course, because that would also mean that you were to bring forward a war of aggression. Secondly, though we, of course, follow the one China policy, this is the way that we do, both in Sweden as a bilateral state and also having the presidency hat on, I would like to emphasize two things. The rumors of weapon export from China to Russia is a serious thing. If that really were to happen, it would also have consequences. That would be crossing a line which I don't think and hope that China really intends to do. But I would like it very, very clear that it would be a line that would be crossed, and that would have consequences. I mentioned the transatlantic link. I think it's important that all countries stand up for the rights of small states like Taiwan, because I think it's important that we underline all the things that we have in common: democracy, rule of law with the state of Taiwan. And you can do that while at the same time operating the one China policy that we do. They are not in conflict with one another. Thank you.
Okay, recently you had a meeting with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So what did he say about Chinese weapons going to Russia? You can share it with us, we will keep it secret, okay?
I'm sure it would. But I would like to say that when I had this discussion, it was, of course, about NATO membership, and that is no secret because I think it was on Twitter. I think we are very grateful for the support that the US have given to the Swedish NATO application. The record speed that all the 28 member states of NATO that has so far ratified the Swedish and the Finnish NATO applications are unprecedented in the history of NATO. Never before has two states passed so rapidly through the parliamentary procedure. But the most, I would say, astonishing thing, or most, which really proves that we are thought of being security providers or someone who are very welcome into the NATO family, is the speed but with which the United States Senate ratified the Swedish and the Finnish NATO application. That is also in itself unprecedented. And I'm very happy that the Secretary of State Blinken so often alludes to the contribution that we will make to the NATO alliance. That's heartening to hear for us.
Yeah, sure, with everything that is going on in the House of Representatives there. Another question on the fourth row. Yes, the gentleman here.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I welcome Minister Billström. My name is Batuan. I'm a student of political science. And I had a question regarding the veto of Turkey on the NATO membership of Sweden and Finland. So, as you probably know, in May there are elections in Turkey. And my question was, do you think that after the elections, Turkey is going to eventually withdraw its veto? So the idea is that the veto is probably to gain a bit of support for the incumbent president in his home country. So my question was, do you think that Sweden will still will be a member in 2023 after the elections in Turkey? And it doesn't matter if the elections bring a new president or not. Do you think it will happen after the Turkish elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm of course answering this in my bilateral capacity and not as the EU representative of the EU presidency. It's up to Turkey to do this, because this is a decision by the Turkish parliament, what they do. We hope to become full members of NATO as soon as possible, as I have stated in many interviews since I became foreign minister. And given the current deteriorating security situation, it is vital that that happens. We have taken the memorandum that was signed in Madrid at the NATO summit in Madrid between Turkey, Finland and Sweden seriously. We have done everything that was written in the memorandum to the last issue, down to delivering only yesterday the new bill to Parliament. I'm not talking about the NATO bill, I'm talking about the bill on preventing terror organizations from operating on Swedish territory, the final building block. We believe that the Parliament of Turkey should start the ratification process, since we have fulfilled all our commitments. Now, the elections is one thing. Another thing is, because that's a question of an internal debate or an internal process. But whether it is before or after it should be done, that's my clear answer. I also understand now that Turkey is very busy with a lot of other things related to the terrible, devastating earthquake that has hit the country, and where Sweden, together with many other EU members, have been very active in trying to provide aid to the Turkish people. I myself called on the evening to my colleague, the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, offering him not only bilateral help from Sweden, but also to host a donors conference to bring in more money. And that's going to happen very soon now in March. And I believe that Mevlut Çavuşoğlu not only were very thankful, he has also said that there were two ministers who called him, the two first to call him. And it was me, and it was the foreign minister of Greece. And that says something about the commitment that we all should have to helping the Turkish people in this moment, and also to understand that this is part and parcel of the process which you're talking about. I'm sure that there is a lot of things to deal with also for the Turkish government at this moment in time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And interesting, of course, probably Belgium was number 27, unfortunately, as we all know. And next question. Maybe here on the fourth row, so that gives a bit of gymnastics for the other ones. Yes, thank you.
Herr utrikesminister, what is your view on a potential situation in which Finland's NATO application is ratified separately from Sweden's in regards to Swedish diplomatic relations and security policy? Thank you.
Kiitos. I take it that you're from Finland. Right, yes. We are so close that we recognize the dialects of one another. Thank you very much for the question. I've said this also before, and I'm reiterating the answer now. As I've mentioned before, the security cooperation between Sweden and Finland are very close, and have been so for many years. We share many mutual military training sessions yearly, and there is a lot of understanding between Sweden and Finland that this military cooperation is vital and important for both of us. Now, if there were to be a very short time space after Finland were to join NATO separately, that wouldn't mean so much, honestly. It wouldn't really do so. But in the long run, it would mean a lot. And it wouldn't mean a lot just to Sweden and Finland, but to the entire NATO family. Because planning military operations in the Baltic Sea region requires a lot of understanding of how geography and military strategic geography works. Producing results under circumstances where only Finland were to be a member and not Sweden would mean problems when it comes to supplying Finland. It would mean problems when it comes to distributing responsibilities within the NATO family. So in the long run, there would be problems. And this has also been said by my dear colleague, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pekka Haavisto, when he had been asked questions several times during the time when he and I have been colleagues in the Foreign Affairs Council here in Brussels. So short time, no problem. Long time, rather large problems, I would say. Thank you.
Will the upcoming elections in Finland change their position, do you think? Or is this something that is broadly shared in Finland, that you should join together?
I believe that there is full commitment over the entire spectra of those parties who are in favor of NATO membership that Sweden and Finland should join. That's, a given thing. There is no one against that for obvious reasons. This question is, however, not in the hands of neither the Finnish government nor the Swedish government. It is in the hands of the Turkish government. And we can't really influence those apart from fulfilling the memorandum which both Sweden and Finland have done.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
First of all, thank you for the speech. I'm Lina, I'm studying philosophy. And so between war and peace, there is Moldova, namely Moldova is between Romania, which is EU in NATO, and the border has also Ukraine. And it's known that it has a destabilized politics because our governance is European-oriented, but Russians tries to destabilize the situations through their unique ways. So my question is, how do you view the role of Moldova in this war?
Okay, Moldova, a bit the forgotten member state, squeezed between Romania and Ukraine, also with an occupied territory de facto by Russians, Transnistria. What do you think that is to be expected in the near future?
Well, certainly not forgotten. I was present at the donors conference that the EU convened to bring aid to the Moldovan people who have suffered greatly from rising energy prices. That conference took place in Paris in the autumn, and it provided the Moldovan government with much needed funds in order to get through the winter, which I actually think that Moldova has done in a very successful way. But I think your question is very valid. We need to stand up for Moldova's right also to choose its own security arrangements and to choose its path. The Transnistria certainly provides Russia with, I wouldn't say an open door, but at least a small gap in order to cause problems. But I think that the Moldovan government needs political and economic support onwards in order to get through this, and we will do that. There is a lot of planning going on when it comes to Moldova within the EU to provide more help and more stability. But I think that the most important thing is to show to the Moldovan people that the way ahead is towards the EU, to provide them with the same hope that is keeping the Ukrainian people fighting, and that which has also, if we look at Georgia, presented some very interesting results lately, namely that the Georgian people also out on the streets shows their government that they are not at the least interested in laws, in adopting laws copied from Putin's law book. They also want to have a path towards the EU. They also want their right to raise their voices about the future of their country and their government. And we should do exactly the same when it comes to Moldova. And no one has the right to instigate a coup d'etat or something similar on another state's territory. That should also be made very clear to those who perhaps speculate about such a strategy.
Okay, thank you. The latest this noon, I think, is that the law in Tbilisi is suspended, so that we will not go through. But indeed, I think that's the one capital in Europe and beyond where you find the most European Union flags. I would like to continue a bit on Moldova. I can understand that a country that has not a full control over its territory cannot become a member of NATO, but can it become a member of the EU? We have already Cyprus, so the government in Nicosia is not in full control of its territory. Does that mean to you that also Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova can become an EU member state?
Well, it's very interesting that you mention Cyprus, because Cyprus is perhaps a good example of a bad example, to be honest. I think that maybe when the time was up for Cyprus to join the EU should have pushed for a solution to the ongoing conflict in Cyprus, and it was a missed opportunity in my mind, but we didn't use that. Now, the situation, of course, with Moldova is different, but there are some similarities, especially to have a contested territory being brought in. Now, of course, with Ukraine, that's also something which we have to talk about, and it's also one of the reasons why the re-establishment of the territorial integrity of Ukraine is so important. However, the division when it comes to Moldova is a different one. Moldova isn't really occupied in the sense that Ukraine is occupied by a foreign force. But I say that this is something which we have to look very closely on, because Cyprus wasn't perhaps it isn't the best example to bring in if you want to look to a solution to a EU membership.
Okay, but it's also a clear sign that the EU is not to be blackmailed, of course, by other powers when it comes to its membership. There were a couple of other questions there. Yes, please, the two gentlemen.
Right. Thank you, Your Excellency, for taking the time to not just speak but answer our questions here today. I'm Lucas. I'm a student of the Masters of European Studies here. And regarding the global situation of women rights, hello? All right. And the recent events in Afghanistan or Iran, to just name a few, and looking at the fact that other countries in the EU have started to adopt a female foreign policy, I question myself, or I ask myself, why Sweden, who used to be the pioneer of female foreign policy, decided to divert from that path in 2022 by not labeling its foreign policy feminist anymore. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, you used the word lastly because I recognized you said female foreign policy and then you said feminist because it is actually the last thing which we have changed. We decided as a new government that there had been several problems with using this etiquette, mostly because if you say that you have a feminist foreign policy, from that follows that all aspects of what you do should be brought into that specific context, and we found that that was more problematic. However, what we do say from the new Swedish government is that gender equality is always a core value of Sweden. That hasn't changed a bit, and that is something which I think that mostly all parties in the Swedish parliament and those parties who make up the present Swedish government definitely adhere to. And gender equality is important for so many reasons. It's important because it promotes not only the important fundamental values, but we also know that gender equality promotes economic prosperity. One of the reasons why we don't have that in countries like Afghanistan, very good example, and where we see now that things are backsliding in Afghanistan, that should bring us to the conclusion that yes, gender equality is very important. And we are not going to change that from this government. On the contrary, I myself made several speeches where I pointed to that both Iran and Afghanistan, there is a need to talk about women's rights specifically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question, just one row further. Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture, Minister. Vladislav Vlasov, I'm alumni. So my question is, how do you envision the European and Swedish relationship with Russia in the post-war time? Thank you.
Okay, relations with Russia after or during the war that is ongoing?
Well, Russia remains geographically where it is. That's not going to change. So we have to think about this, and we have to think about it closely. But I don't have a solution right now because this depends very much on how the war will end, because the war will end at the negotiating table sooner or later. We believe from the Swedish government that the only way forward is for Ukraine to win in the battlefield militarily. This is the only way of bringing forward a situation where Ukraine will be able to regain its territorial integrity, which was a reason why this war started in the first place. And it didn't start, by the way, in 2022, it started in 2014. So let me be very clear on this. Crimea is also a part of Ukraine, and therefore also a part of its territorial integrity. So that we have to be very clear on. And that means that what's going to happen when the war ends and Ukraine has its territorial integrity restored is that we have to think about how the relationship will be with Russia. And you can envisage a lot of situations here. North and South Korea, we have already spoken about Cyprus. There are many, many discussions about how that border management is going to work out. The most important thing, however, is that the EU accepts that Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union in the fullness of time. That's going to happen because the Ukrainian people are partially fighting this war also for the right of self-determination of their security arrangements and where they want to belong. And that also goes back to the Euromaidan and the decision taken by the Ukrainian people at that moment in time. We have to think about where Russia is heading, though, regardless of this. Once Ukraine is inside of the European Union, and probably in the future also a member of NATO, that part of their security arrangement will be handled. But we will still be facing a Russia which I think could go many ways. You could see Russia developing as Germany did following 1918 into a country which is revanchist, which is hateful, which is something equal to perhaps North Korea in its outlook towards the rest of the world. It's also very likely, however, that the military defeat in Russia might lead to a regime change. But whether that will lead to an improvement or a deterioration remains to be seen, and we can have a lot of speculation about that as well. regardless of which way, we have to think about a European policy towards Russia at the end of the day. And although that is a way off in time, it is good to start thinking about that now. The ideas of what to do with Germany after the Second World War didn't erupt out of nowhere in May 1945. Those discussions started much, much earlier, and perhaps we should also think about that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Last but one question from the student side, from the back, please. Take the floor.
Hello.
Hello, please briefly introduce yourself.
I'm Niels de Schepper from Belgium. I had a question. What will your government do if it turns out Ukraine blew up the Nord Stream pipeline?
Okay, that's the elephant in the room, the hot topic. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much as well. Well, first of all, we have a very good principle in Sweden, and that is that we separate powers. There is one branch which is executive, to which I belong, there is another which is legislative, and there is a third which is judiciary. And we shouldn't mix them up. Presently, there is an investigation ongoing following this explosion at the Nord Stream. And that investigation is still ongoing by the prosecutor's office. And I'm not in a position to make any comments about that until there is a final report presented by the prosecutor's office. There are a lot of speculations. It has been clearly stated, however, by the prosecutor's office that there was a sabotage, so we know that happened. But as for the rest, that is something which is in their hands. So I'm not going to speculate any further about this or the possible consequences of an outcome of that.
Okay, fine. Here in Belgium, we are less familiar with the strict separation of powers. Here we have the answer. Well, that is a matter of fact, I'm afraid. But here we have the saying, never answer an if question, following the advice of Jean-Luc Dehaene. The last question on the other side from the students' part. Yes, please, in the middle. Where's the microphone?
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your time. My name is Aaron. I study political science. My question, following up on the meeting with Secretary Blinken and Sweden's relationship with the United States, does the polarized opinion of the American people on America and the United States' position in NATO concern Sweden? And would the potential situation of the United States pulling out of NATO under a different president change Sweden's position on the alliance due to America's power and sway?
Okay, what if DeSantis wins the elections in 24 and he says NATO, game over? What is going to happen then?
Well, first of all, I don't really think that's going to happen. Even, you know, when President Trump was in the presidency, there were a lot of talk, there were a lot of arguments, as there often is also within the NATO family, as is the case with the EU, but there was never any serious proposal of the US leaving the NATO. And again, I think that some of the issues being brought forward from the side of the US towards the rest of the NATO family, most importantly, the question of money and the funding of NATO activities and the NATO defense on a bilateral level, I think are valid questions. It is right and proper to talk about what you do with your own defense. And as we can see now, a lot of the issues which were very, how should we say, sensitive, someone would even say toxic, when it came to the funding of your own military capability to defend yourself, according to Article 3 in the Washington Treaty. That has since then, you know, evaporated. Now we are seeing a lot of countries who actually perhaps think about the 2% goal of GDP being spent on military budgets, not as a roof, but as a floor. And that's quite a turning point. We could talk about Poland, we could talk about Germany as well with the Zeitenwende and everything which is going on. So I don't really think that particular subject is so toxic as it was in those days. And I personally believe that we are soon the soon-to-be NATO members, we have to do our part of the job in order to be credible. After all, if you look at the military, expenses that the US have put into Ukraine, we should match that from the EU. We should try to do our best. We are doing our best when it comes to supporting Ukraine financially, but we actually have to do more in order to become more credible in the eyes of the US people. I think that's right and proper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We are almost closing this open Q&A session, but I would like to conclude with 3 more questions to you, but the answers can be very brief. The first one is about empathy in international policy. The last ambassador lecture series, we had Federica Mogherini as our guest, so the former High Representative, now the Rector of the College of Europe. She said basically 2 things. We have to be very strict as far as core values is concerned, but we also need more empathy in international affairs. We need to do a bigger effort to try to understand what the other partners is meaning. Would you agree? That's my first question. My second question is about the role of universities. As a foreign affairs minister, what role is left for universities in terms of a diplomacy? Is there a role to play, and if so, yes? And third and final question, what is the one take-home message you would like to say to the students in this audience after this afternoon? What do they really need to keep in mind? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's almost as if we're opening a new session, I would say, with a new
but
speech.
The answers can be very brief.
I will be very brief. Thank you very much again for this and for inviting me here. And about the first question, yes, I agree with Madame Mogherini. I think it's quite right to show more empathy in diplomacy. And many of the items which we're talking about right now, which I have highlighted, has to do with empathy. To understand, for example, that if we show more understanding about why the Global South isn't joining our side, the rightful side, in the votes in the UN General Assembly, we should think about why that is the case. It cannot simply be that Russia or China is more successful, more professional, or whatever, when it comes to disinformation. It goes much deeper. I think, for example, that if we were to talk about the war in Ukraine as a colonial war, as an imperial war, which is exactly what Russia is doing in Ukraine today, trying to go back to Tsarist imperialism as a tool, I think we would be met with more understanding from a country that, like, say, India, for example. When it comes to Africa, the EU has to be more engaged in what's going on in Africa, both from a diplomatic point of view, but also when it comes to standing up for, let's say, projects like the Global Gateway, opening up our economy to goods and to services from Africa. And we should think about that from an emphatic point of view. How can we work together more with the countries in the Global South? And that is a responsibility for EU politicians to try and form a policy that works. I personally believe that we should do more in that regard, and that there are more possibilities for this. The role of universities, yes, never before has universities been so important, I think, to the world as they are today. Although they are sometimes struggling a bit to find their way in an ocean of information technology, AI, and all the challenges that are being posed to modern education. I personally believe, though, that universities, and I've seen many of you students taking the floor here today who belong to various nations and various states, bringing people together for a common purpose, namely to educate themselves, is something which has brought humanity to where we are today. We would never stand here having this kind of, not only well-versed and diplomatic conversation, unless we have had those centuries behind us of people coming to places like this. In order for that to continue to function, we have to think a lot about the role of education and how to manage it and how to finance it. And this means that we as decision makers in our respective states have to think through this. There are lots of challenges ahead. I mentioned but a few of them. But I think that AI might prove both a possibility and maybe a threat, depending on how we work with it. Finally, something for the students to take home. Well, I think that there are two things that I think should be the trademark of a student: to be creative and to be critical. These are the two most important tools, and they might sound like something very easy, although I have to say that when I was sitting both in Cambridge and at Lund University struggling with my thesis, I found it sometimes difficult to be neither of them, or both of them. But speaking before you today, I think that being a student today also is challenging, especially with regards to the labor market. But sometimes one should keep more an eye about academia, more an eye towards the academia, and think more about what I can produce during my time as a student. I personally feel that that is very helpful when I look back at my years in politics, to know that when I was a student, made the most of talking and debating and discussing with people and writing one or two theses as well. I wish you all the best, all the luck. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And again, I think that this has been a very, very good experience for me also as a foreign minister. And you can never have too many discussions with students and professors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of the rector, I would once again like to thank Minister Billström for his time and for his engagement this afternoon, given your very busy schedule. I would like to thank the audience, specifically, of course, the students who have raised questions. I would also like to thank the colleagues behind the scene in helping to organize this event. Alla brasa kommer I trea. Something is my Swedish not too bad? Okay. Alle goede dingen bestaan uit drie. All good things come in three, as we say here in Flanders. First, I would like to invite Marianne Thijssen, as president of the board of KU Leuven, to hand you over a charter as a memory of your engagement with the Wilfried Martens Fund. Please. Second, I would like to ask the rector to hand over you some reading on the plane back to Stockholm. We are very happy to provide you with a copy of a truly golden handbook. As you might know, it was Thomas More Utopia 500 years ago that was printed here in Leuven. A lot of festivities have been going on, and the outcome, one of the many things, is book. So please have a nice reading. Third and lastly, and then we're really going to make it to close, is the gift of the audience that I would like to ask once more to have a big applause for our guest of this evening. Have a nice, safe trip back home. Thank you.